My dear catechists, welcome back to our discussion on the seven sacraments. And in the previous video clips, we have discussed about the sacraments in general, and also the sacraments of baptism and sacrament of confirmation. And today we are going to pay attention to the sacrament of Holy Eucharist and also the sacrament of reconciliation. When you talk about the sacrament of Holy Eucharist, and you know it is the central, the most important of all other sacraments. All the other sacraments are directed towards the Holy Eucharist, because the Christ is rendered present in this in his Paschal sacrifice, in this sacrament of Holy Eucharist, entirely and wholly, fully. And we know all the other seven sacraments are bound with this. They are bound with the Paschal mystery, as we have seen earlier. Therefore, here we celebrate the sacrament of Holy Eucharist, where the Christ is entirely present. And also, the sacrament of Holy Eucharist completes the Christian initiation. Christian initiation, which began with the sacrament of baptism and then the sacrament of confirmation, and it is completed with the reception of the communion. And as you can see, when the baptisms are taking place, first the candidate receives the baptism and then the confirmation, and then he goes for the Holy Mass to receive Holy Eucharist. So that is in that way this the Christian initiation is completed. It is also called the source and the summit of Christian life. As you could see, the Holy Eucharist being the central sacrament, it is the source from where we draw inspiration. All the other sacraments, all the other apostolates, everything draws inspiration, and they are bound up with this sacrament. And also it is the summit, the highest of all celebration, where we experience the presence of the Lord. It is the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. Therefore, all the other ministries are oriented towards it. Also, through the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, we anticipate and we join the eternal life, and that is what we are all expecting. So through the celebration of the Holy Eucharist, that heavenly wedding, we anticipate. And what is this sacrament called? We know it has different names, but they all have meaning. And it is called Eucharist, and it is an action of thanksgiving. This Eucharist comes from the Greek word Eucharistein in Greek, which means thanksgiving. So this Eucharist has the meaning of thanksgiving. It is also called the Lord's Supper, connected the supper he had with disciples on the eve of his passion. It anticipated the wedding feast of the Lamb in the heavenly Jerusalem, and we know this Eucharist was instituted during the Last Supper. So it is also called the Lord's Supper. It is also called the breaking of bread. Jesus, in that ritual, he took bread and he broke it, just like in a Jewish meals, where the master of the table blesses and distributes the bread, and then breaking of bread took place. Therefore, it is also called the breaking of bread, and it is taking place in the celebration of the Holy Eucharist. It is also called the Eucharistic Assembly, because it is celebrated with the assembly of the faithful, with the people. So it is a visible expression of the church, right? So church gathers to celebrate this sacrament. It is also called the Holy Sacrifice. It make present the one sacrifice of Christ, because it is an important aspect in the Holy Eucharist, we commemorate his sacrifice on the cross. It is also called the Holy and Divine Liturgy, and is the center and the most intense expression of our liturgy. All our liturgical activities are bound up with this. And then it is called the Holy Communion. We unite ourselves to Christ as sharers of his body and blood, because we all share the same bread and same wine, so his body and blood. Then we pay attention to the institution of the Eucharist, and we know, like in many other sacraments, we also have the kind of Old Testament prefigurations about the Eucharist, where Old Testament symbolically tells us something about the Eucharist. And one of such examples is the sacrifice of Melchizedek, the priest and the king. And we find his story in the Old Testament, and he's a kind of an imaginary high priest, and he is offering bread and wine. We read in Genesis chapter 14 verse 18, we read that, and God nourishing his people with manna in the desert journey, and he giving the people this manna from heaven, and it is also pointed towards Christ feeding his church through the Eucharist in his journey to eternal banquet. The Passover celebration that involved a feast of unleavened bread commemorated God freeing them from Egypt, and it was to be celebrated as a memorial. And then we know the Paschal celebration, the Passover celebration with the Jews had, it was a memorial of their, it commemorated their passage from Egypt to Promised Land. And then Eucharist also a new Passover. It commemorates and celebrates Christ's event from death to life. And then we turn to the prefigurations in the New Testament before the institution of the Eucharist. Wedding feast of Cana, where Jesus turned water into wine. The words at the Last Supper, I shall not drink, refers to the Christ's wedding feast, Christ's wedding to his church. And in certain way, this wedding feast of Cana also prefigures, because there we find the Jesus' first miracle is taking place, turning water into wine, and later we find that he turning water into his own blood. The miracle of the multiplication of loaves that we find in Matthew chapter 14 foreshadowed the great event of Jesus turning bread into his own body. Similarly, he multiplies loaves and then he feeds the people, and which happens today in the Eucharist. And then the institution of the Holy Eucharist took place at the Last Supper, and we read in all the three synoptic Gospels the record of institution of the Eucharist by Christ in the Last Supper. Luke chapter 22 and Matthew 26 and Mark chapter 14. And you also find that the fourth Gospel, the Gospel of John, does not carry an account of the institution of the Eucharist. Instead of that, we will find the Jesus foot washing ceremony. But his long discourse at the synagogue of Capernaum prepares a setting for the Eucharist. If you go to John chapter 6, you find a long discussion on the bread of life, and there we find that Jesus is preparing the people and to reception of this sacrament. And there it has three parts. If you take the take Jesus discourse on the Eucharist. Jesus is presented as bread of life. I am the bread of life that came down from heaven. So he's giving himself as our food. And the believer is, in the second, the believer is invited to eat his body and drink his blood. And the discourse talks about, explains it. And that Eucharist is our food and our drink. And the third part gives a negative reaction of some people and reaffirmation of the importance of this cause. And when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, people were surprised and amazed, and they were trying to stone him. And because he was asking to eat his own flesh and drink his own blood. But then, even amidst their reaction, Jesus reaffirms, yes, I am the bread of life. If you don't eat my bread, eat my body and drink my blood, there won't be any connection with you. And also in the epistle, St. Paul presents two accounts of the Eucharist. One of his institution that we find in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and also the other in the context of the prohibition of Christians to take part in the pagan sacrificial meals. And there St. Paul explains how the Lord instituted the sacrament of Holy Eucharist. We also can discuss the signs, the external sign of the sacrament, as we have done in other two sacraments. The matter, the matter of the sacrament of Eucharist is the bread made from wheat and wine from fruit of grape and water. So that is the matter what you can see. And then the form is the word usually that follows the matter. And the words of the institution are, take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body, which will be given up for you. And similar words are said also on the chalice, on wine. So that is the form of this sacrament. And we also have in church tradition this important term called the Transubstantiation. Usually we find that when we talk about transubstantiation, yes, we see that bread and wine is transformed into body and blood of Christ, but it remains the same. Usually when things grow, the accidents, so what we can see is qualities, they remain, they change, accidents change, and the substance remain. For example, we were small and we have grown up now, yes, but then some of our features have changed, but then we are the same person. And if you take even a tree, right, a small tree, it has now grown and bearing fruit and flowers, but then the substance is the same. When it comes to the Eucharist, what happens is the other way. Accidents, what we can see, remain unchanged, but the substance changes. So it is no more bread and wine, but it is, though it looks like that, but it is the body and blood of Christ. Substance changes, but the accidents, what we can see, what we can perceive, remain unchanged. The presence of Christ in the Eucharist is perpetual as long as species continue as such. That means that it's not only during the Eucharist that Christ is present in the bread and wine, in the consecrated bread. It is He's present always. Therefore, we have we are able to take Holy Communion to the sick and those who have not been able to attend the Holy Eucharist, prisoners like elders, those sick people, all that. And also, because of this understanding, there is also the devotion to the Blessed Sacrament that was later developed as the Eucharist was reserved in the tabernacle. So remember that Christ is not only present in the consecrated bread during the Eucharist, but also afterward in the consecrated bread he is present. So we have the veneration of the holy reserved sacrament. Then we will turn to the Sacrament of Penance, or the Sacrament of Reconciliation. Christ instituted the Sacrament of Reconciliation for all sinful members of His Church, for those who, since baptism, have fallen into grave sins and have lost their baptismal grace and wounded ecclesial communion. It is to them that the Sacrament of Penance offers a new possibility to convert and to recover the grace of justification. And that is the explanation given, instruction given at the Catechism of the Catholic Church. So Sacrament of Reconciliation is where, as you all know, where we receive forgiveness for the sins that we have committed. So through this sacrament, the God's mercy is made available to us. What is this sacrament called? It is called the Sacrament of Conversion, because it makes sacramentally present the Jesus' call to conversion. And then as we receive the sacrament of reconciliation, we are invited to change our life, to convert our life. And the Sacrament of Penance, it is called the Sacrament of Penance. It consecrates sinners, Christian sinners' personal and ecclesial steps of conversion, penance, and the satisfaction. Then it is also called the Sacrament of Confession, because there is disclosure of one's sins to the priest that is taking place. So you have to confess your sins. So therefore, because of this central action, we call it the Sacrament of Confession. Sacrament of Forgiveness, because penitent is made to experience God's pardon and peace when the priest gives the absolution, and he should be feeling within that his sins are forgiven. So it is called the Sacrament of Forgiveness. It is also the Sacrament of Reconciliation. Through this sacrament, the penitent is able to reconcile himself with God, with himself, with God, and also with others. Okay, we'll turn to the Old Testament and the scriptures to see what we could see how this idea of forgiveness is mentioned in the scriptures. There are so many examples, but just I will be taking only a very few. The fall of the first parent was succeeded by a series of other sins, and you find from the very beginning a man falling into sin, the first murder of Cain, and then later we find infidelity towards God by the people of Israel, and they were now and again they becoming unfaithful. And then sin of chosen men like David's double sin of adultery and murder, and we know the story. So this idea of sin, and is man turning away from God, is found in the Old Testament in different stages, in different persons. The covenant with God was bound up with ritual sacrifices for sins, and then there was always some ritual was available. The priests conducting certain rituals to cleanse, purify the people. And one example is this: they are declaring their sins upon the God, and then chasing that goat to the wilderness as a sign that all their sins are now forgiven. So And also individually performing penances was necessary for God's forgiveness, which sometimes came with some punishment. And then also, in order to receive God's forgiveness, every persons as a group, also as individually, they had to do certain penances and also ask forgiveness. So the example of David's, and then there was also this punishment, because, and we find that in the once though the David's sins were forgiven, sin of adultery and murder, but then the child that was born of that relationship died.